Hello and welcome to Vestiges of History, where we tell of storied lives. I hope you're having a glorious day. Now, what I have for you today is Chapter 2 of The Search for Sergeant Sasaoka. If you haven't seen the first edition, please check the link in the description. Sasaoka was the first video to drop on this channel to raise awareness for him and all unrecovered war dead whose memories drift like sand through our fingers every single day. So let's get into it. I dug into the research and requested his official military personnel file and individual deceased personnel file. I received 48 pages of neither of those, but the investigation of his death with files dating between 1947 and 1953. So let's start pulling threads. We know that the last time he was under military control was 22 October 1944 on that mountain trail in France on a machine gun on the back of a tank. He is wounded and falls off while returning fire long enough for his platoon to retreat. The next time we see him, he is in a prisoner of war camp in Poland. In May of 1945, hostilities in Europe ended and the military gears began to switch to new goals. One of these is an accounting and recovery of American war dead through the American Graves Registration Services. Those classified as missing in action also fall under their umbrella of responsibility. After searching German administration files to trace Sasaoka's movements to Stalag IIIC in Kustrin, Poland, visiting the site and finding it destroyed, they began to send out letters asking for eyewitness statements for those also imprisoned with Sasaoka. Harry Kamikawa, who was mentioned in the last video, had this to say on 10 December 1945.
I last saw him on the morning of the 31st January 1945 about 10, as we were being marched out of our prisoner war camp, Stalag IIIC, near Kustrin, Germany. We were ambushed by the Russian tanks and fired upon. The Russian tanks kept on firing until an American soldier went up to them explaining that we were Americans, and in that firing by the Russians, a few of our boys got killed and a few wounded. The Russians called us toward them, and about 300 of us ran toward them. By then, the German guards gathered up the rest of the boys and marched them back to the camp, taking them as hostages. In all that excitement, I did not see where Sergeant Sasaoka went to, but I know for sure he wasn't one of the 300 that ran toward the Russians because I was in that group, and I asked all the boys if they had seen him, and the answer was no. The following day, the rest of the boys that were marched back to camp were liberated, except about 200 that were taken as hostages by the Germans and were marched in the direction of the town of Kustrin. I asked the boys that were liberated the following day if they had seen Sergeant Sasaoka, and the answer was no again, and no one could tell if he was one of the 200 that were taken as hostages to Kustrin.
Now that sounds pretty horrific, and he gives a pretty detailed account, right? But he wasn't the only witness that day. A young Mike Tokunaga also gave an account.
On December 12th of 1945, Staff Sergeant Michael M. Tokunaga made the following statement concerning Staff Sergeant Sasaoka. Sergeant Sasaoka lived with me in the same barracks and on the morning of January 31st moved out together under German orders. Approximately 2.5 to 3 miles out of the camp, we were suddenly fired upon by Russians who had mistaken the identity of the marching column. Sergeant Sasaoka was alive at this moment. I crossed the road and lay down behind a tree. After that, I did not see Sergeant Sasaoka. I made my way back to the camp with the aid of 2 friends. I was separated from another Japanese-American boy, Sergeant Harry Kamikawa, the only one in this camp besides Sergeant Sasaoka and myself. This boy went with a group of approximately 300 to be immediately rescued by the Russians. We each thought that Sergeant Sasaoka was with the other. About 2 weeks later, I met Sergeant Kamikawa in a small Polish town near the German border and was surprised to find that Sergeant Sasaoka was not with him. I inquired but could not locate Sergeant Sasaoka or learn of his fate. I do know that some bodies became unidentifiable due to shell fire and the result of Russian tanks crushing bodies. I believe the Russians could have identified him by means of his dog tags or a German prisoner identification tag, both of which I definitely know he had on his person. I cannot say that I saw the body of Sergeant Sasaoka or saw him wounded, but I believe that he is now dead.
So, we have some similarities and some differences. Sasaoka was not the only missing soldier associated with Stalag IIIC. Several individuals were also missing in action that were being held there. So on top of the search for Sasaoka, there was a concerted effort to recover the remains of these other fighting men, and some were successful. We see records related to individuals not associated with his search in this file, and that's because they share the same investigative group. What ended up happening is they sent a military mission to Moscow to negotiate for permission to search for these remains, because remember, after 1945, the Russians were no longer our brothers in arms. Something else that's interesting is that his official military personnel file and his individual deceased personnel file, or IDPF, have been lost since at least 1951. They found that his files had been moved to another record center and disappeared after that point. The case gets passed around again and again, with some remains recovered. The Burgermeister of Kustrin gave an interview, and they excavated portions of the community cemetery in Kustrin. Different agents tried it from different angles, and honestly, they deserve all the respect in the world for even attempting this. They were doing this work inside a Soviet satellite country. Moscow sneezes and Poland catches a cold. They took their lives in their hands and risked never seeing America or their families again, and between 1948 and 1952, there were at least 4 attempts to recover Sasaoka and other men lost from Stalag IIIC. They searched the cemetery and the woods and are denied access to certain areas by the communist military. Chiyono Sasaoka, his mother, wrote to the United States government from Japan in 1948. She lived just outside of Hiroshima and survived the bombing. She writes that she is now bedridden and, from what she describes, has cancer. She writes to them first about the investigation into her son's assumed death, and then asks for her son's back pay to be sent to her in Japan to make her last days more comfortable. Our government does this. So initially, the AGRS, the American Graves Registration Service, had classified Sasaoka's death as 1 March 1946 because that was the actual end of hostilities of World War II. But through the thorough investigation of the AGRS with the evidence and testimony from Mike Tokunaga and Harry Kamikawa, Staff Sergeant Itsumu Sasaoka likely died on 31 January 1945 in that chaos of mistaken identity. Masaru, Itsumu's older brother, took it upon himself to look for his brother and was a diligent force to keep Itsumu's flame lit for over a decade. I have spoken to members of Sasaoka's family. They are the grandchildren of Masaru. None of them remember their great-uncle Itsumu, and even their parents, Itsumu's nieces and nephews, were too young to have core memories of their uncle before he left for the army. Masaru never spoke about his brother or the search for his remains with any of his children or his grandchildren. I can respect this, and it made for some interesting phone conversations with these descendants. The search for Staff Sergeant Itsumu Sasaoka didn't end in 1952. It just took a break. I hope these videos ignite some renewed interest in this American soldier. And even if the searches remain unsuccessful, the effort is always worth it. I want to dedicate this series to Staff Sergeant Sasaoka, but not only to him, but all Nisei of the 100th and 442nd Regimental Combat Team. And as always, you never know who will tell your story. Live a storied life.